have those discussions, and then if a good deal is there, yes, we will sign it. But if it's not there, we're not going to sign a bad deal. What I would say to Canadians, the good news is virtually everybody wants to do more with Canada because we have what the world wants. We have the values to which most of the world aspires. We're a reliable partner.
In a year-end interview, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a calm but pointed message that dismantled the core assumptions behind Donald Trump's trade strategy. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't posture, he didn't attack. He simply laid out, point by point, a picture of a Canada that is stronger, more independent, and far less vulnerable to Washington's pressure than Trump has claimed for 2 years. By the end, one message hovered over the entire conversation. Canada is done playing defense in Trump's trade war. The country is now steering the pace, and Trump can't dictate the terms anymore.
So that's true in Asia, whether it's the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, the ASEAN countries, which are almost a quarter of the world's GDP. It's Indonesia, it's the European Union, it's the UK, it's the countries of the Gulf. United Arab Emirates is going to invest $70 billion, $0 billion in Canada. They've made a commitment to that. They made the commitment. We didn't even ask, that comes. So people want to do more with Canada.
The interview took place in a setting rich with symbolism, the Canadian Museum of History, surrounded by stories of identity, sovereignty, and nationhood. It immediately grounded the audience in the scale of the moment. This wasn't just a political check-in, it was a status report on a country undergoing a rapid transformation. Carney came into office following a snap election triggered by Justin Trudeau's resignation, a moment that plunged Ottawa into uncertainty just as Washington escalated tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and nearly every major Canadian export sector. Trump's hope was simple: overwhelm a new prime minister before he finds his footing. But 8 months later, Carney sat confidently in front of the camera, not only unfazed by the trade war, but using it to rewire Canada's economic and strategic direction. He confirmed that formal negotiations with Washington have not begun, and he made no apology for the delay. Canada, he explained, becomes stronger every week negotiations don't happen. The economy is stabilizing, investment is flowing, and new international partnerships are forming faster than at any point in the last decade. Trump may believe time is on America's side, but Carney made it clear that in this confrontation, time strengthens Canada, not the United States. Then came the line that defined the interview. Carney said plainly, the United States is no longer a reliable partner. The quiet confidence of that statement carried more weight than any dramatic confrontation could. Trump has spent years insisting Canada is dependent, boxed in, and ultimately powerless in the face of American market dominance. Yet Carney's interview dismantled that assumption without ever mentioning Trump by name. His analysis of the past 8 months revealed a Canada that has diversified its economic ties, strengthened its domestic industries, and cultivated new sources of investment at a pace Washington never accounted for. The subtext was unmistakable. A country with options cannot be intimidated, and Canada now has more options than at any point in its modern trade history. Trump's core mistake is assuming Canada is the same country it was the last time he renegotiated NAFTA. It isn't. Carney's government has opened deep channels with Europe, accelerated cooperation in Asia, and secured major investment commitments from partners in the Gulf, all while tightening Canada's industrial base at home. The U.S. may still be Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only path to growth. And that makes Trump's tariffs dramatically less effective than advertised. Another subtle but devastating point emerged when Carney discussed the pace of negotiations. The United States is waiting for a Supreme Court ruling on whether Trump's tariff machinery is even constitutional. That ruling could reshape the entire foundation of Trump's economic strategy. Meanwhile, Canada loses nothing by waiting. Carney framed patience not as hesitation but as strategic discipline, and the logic is clear. Why negotiate from a position of uncertainty when the legal ground under Washington itself may shift in a matter of months? This is not stalling, it is calculated advantage. Trump is stuck in a holding pattern, forced to defend a system whose durability he cannot guarantee. Carney, by contrast, is free to strengthen Canada's leverage in real time.
Carney also turned the politically charged pipeline discussion into a surprisingly sharp message about economic independence. He clarified that the agreement with Alberta is not a green light for immediate construction, but the creation of conditions under which a project could even be proposed. And then he added the sentence that rewired the entire conversation. Having another pipeline to the United States is less advantageous. In one move, he undercut the assumption that Washington can always use energy dependency to corner Ottawa. The message was simple. A pipeline to American markets is no longer the strategic victory it once was. Canada wants new buyers. Canada wants diversified access. Canada wants leverage, not another lifeline through the United States. Trump cannot use oil politics as a bargaining chip against a country that is deliberately reducing its exposure to his market.
The most surprising revelation came when Carney argued that Canada now has a real opportunity to leapfrog the United States in clean energy, industrial policy, and next-generation manufacturing. While Trump has spent the past year dismantling renewable projects, freezing offshore wind, and pulling back from long-term climate commitments, Canada has been stitching together a national clean electricity strategy, expanding nuclear, accelerating carbon capture frameworks, and preparing industries for the global low-carbon marketplace. Carney was not making a moral argument, he was making an economic one. Competitive markets are moving toward cleaner, lower carbon production, and countries that align early will dominate future supply chains. If the United States chooses to sit out this transition, Canada will not follow it off that cliff. This is where the interview delivered one of its boldest truths. The question is no longer whether Canada can keep up with American industrial dominance. Carney is preparing for a future in which Canada pulls ahead because the U.S. has chosen a slower, narrower, and more politically constrained path. Carney's comments also signaled a new phase in Canada's role on the world stage. Instead of treating global engagement as a defensive necessity, he described it as a proactive strategy. Countries across Asia, Europe, and the Gulf are now seeking deeper ties with Canada, precisely because the U.S. has become unpredictable. This shift benefits Canada not just economically, but diplomatically, giving Ottawa greater influence in coalitions and multilateral agreements that Washington is increasingly absent from. This is the opposite of Trump's narrative that Canada is isolated or dependent. In reality, it is the United States that is losing partners, while Canada is gaining them. Carney's interview wasn't about sparring with Trump, and that is exactly why it landed so forcefully. Without a hint of aggression, he demonstrated that Canada is not only weathering the trade war, but quietly turning it into a strategic advantage. The country is diversifying its economy, strengthening its alliances, and reducing its exposure to American volatility. The result is a North American relationship Trump never prepared for, a Canada that sets its own pace, protects its own interests, and refuses to negotiate from weakness. The real question going into 2026 isn't whether Canada can withstand Trump's next move. It's whether Trump can withstand a Canada that has stopped waiting for permission to lead. Because after this interview, one thing is undeniable. The United States is no longer holding the upper hand. Canada is.
You know, that's just an ongoing thing. It expires in about a year, and we'll either let it expire or we'll maybe work out another deal with Mexico and Canada. But look, Mexico and Canada have taken advantage of the United States, like just about every other country, in all fairness. It's not them. I'm not blaming them.
And we just heard some fresh comments from U.S. President Donald Trump about where he stands. The trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico is up for review next year.
Donald Trump has once again threatened to blow up the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, but this time something is different. Canada didn't flinch. While Washington under Trump drifts into uncertainty, from tariff fights to lawsuits to open talk of abandoning major trade frameworks, Canada suddenly looks like the stable anchor of North America. Investors are noticing. Capital is slowly drifting north, supply chains are recalibrating, and Ottawa finds itself with leverage Trump never expected. At a high-profile hearing in Washington, senior U.S. trade officials signaled that President Trump may let CUSMA expire in 2026, or even withdraw unilaterally. Reuters added that the White House is seriously evaluating a year-to-year replacement, or even splitting USMCA into two separate deals, one with Canada, one with Mexico. Trump repeated his familiar line, "We'll either let it expire or work out another deal." Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was in Washington for a FIFA event, did not treat the comment like a crisis. His government simply reiterated that Canada would protect its interests calmly and methodically. Mexico, meanwhile, made clear it wants an early USMCA review to restore investment confidence after a turbulent year, and from Ottawa's perspective, any renegotiation must be trilateral, because a fragmented North America only serves Washington's interests, not its partners. Trump's approach hasn't changed since NAFTA was renegotiated: create uncertainty, push markets to panic, and force trading partners to beg for stability. It worked 8 years ago when Canada was more dependent on U.S. access and less confident on the global stage. But the world of 2025 is not the world of 2017. The U.S. economy is wrestling with inflation, volatile markets, and an internal industrial backlash against open-ended tariffs. Major retailers, including Costco, are openly challenging Trump's tariff authority in U.S. courts. Agricultural exporters are warning about retaliatory pain, and Republican governors privately signal mounting discomfort with another prolonged trade war. In this climate, Trump's threats don't land the way they used to. When he says he can walk away, Canada now understands something critical. Washington no longer projects the stability required to sustain its leverage. The real headline this week was not Trump's threat, but Canada's refusal to react emotionally. Carney's team projected a message that resonated far beyond Ottawa. Canada will not negotiate from fear, and it will not act like a country desperate for American permission. Analysts made the point bluntly. If Canada signals it wants the deal at any cost, it gives up every ounce of bargaining power. The Carney government appears fully aware of this. Canada existed before NAFTA, it survived the Trump trade wars of the past decade, and it continues building export pathways that soften dependence on a single market. More importantly, Canada's modern industrial strategy, from clean energy to critical minerals and AI, now attracts global partners who value predictability over chaos. Trump expected Ottawa to scramble. Instead, he ran into something he rarely encounters: a confident, steady counterpart. A subtle but powerful development is unfolding beneath the surface. Trump's advisors have openly discussed splitting USMCA into two deals so the U.S. becomes the central hub of North American trade. If that happened, any company that wants access to all three markets would have to locate inside the United States. But the past few weeks revealed that Canada and Mexico are far less willing to be separated than Trump imagined. Ottawa and Mexico City now share the same assessment. Trilateralism is essential. Fragmentation benefits only the U.S., while unity restrains Washington's ability to dictate terms. For Trump, this is the least favorable configuration. His entire negotiating playbook relies on isolating counterparties and pressuring them individually. A coordinated Canada-Mexico front blocks that approach and forces Washington to confront a reality it would prefer to ignore. Power in North America is more balanced than it appears. Perhaps the most underestimated factor is that the American public itself is no longer enthusiastic about endless tariff battles. Recent U.S. polling shows strong bipartisan support for preserving CUSMA because it keeps prices stable, protects American manufacturing, and prevents supply chain shocks. Corporate America has grown even more vocal. Manufacturers warn about rising production costs. Farmers fear losing export markets they fought to secure. Retail giants protest that ongoing tariff instability disrupts planning and keeps inflation high. At a moment when American households still struggle with elevated prices, another manufactured trade crisis is the last thing consumers want. The irony is unmistakable. Trump's threat to punish Canada now risks punishing the very voters he needs. And Canada knows that. When Ottawa hears Trump talking about blowing up the deal, it also hears the sound of U.S. political pressure closing in around him. Markets have a simple logic. Money flows towards stability. Trump's America, with its shifting tariffs and legal challenges, no longer offers that stability. Canada, under Carney, increasingly does. Businesses value rule of law environments where policies do not change by tweet or by courtroom drama. They look for governments capable of long-term planning. And they prefer supply chains that are predictable rather than politically explosive. Canada's clean energy tax credits, its industrial strategies for EVs and critical minerals, and its expanding Indo-Pacific partnerships all push in one direction, toward a more resilient economy, less vulnerable to U.S. turbulence. The result is a quiet but unmistakable trend. When Washington becomes unpredictable, Ottawa becomes attractive. What makes this shift even more significant is how foreign investors now talk about Canada. In private briefings, global firms describe the country not just as a safer alternative, but as a strategic hedge against U.S. volatility. They see a government capable of long-term thinking, a workforce aligned with future industries, and a political climate that rewards stability instead of theatrics. In a North America that feels increasingly divided between chaos and consistency, Canada is becoming the rational choice. And once capital begins moving toward stability, it rarely turns back.
Trump thought threatening CUSMA would place Canada back on its heels. Instead, it revealed how much the landscape has changed. Canada is not the junior partner it once was. Mexico is no longer isolated. And the U.S. political climate, fractured, inflation-sensitive, and weary of tariff wars, now weakens Trump's leverage more than it strengthens it. If Washington continues down this path, North America may not be shaped by Trump's dominance, but by Canada's stability. The choice facing investors is becoming clearer: a volatile United States or a steady Canada building long-term partnerships. The real question is this: in a continent now defined by uncertainty on one side and confidence on the other, which future will businesses, workers, and global markets choose? The answer may already be forming.
You need to choose your friends wisely. And Sweden is choosing Canada. And I think rightly so. And we're also seeing a very strategic work from Canada, and not least from Prime Minister Carney himself, in choosing his friends globally now very, very strategically. And I think Sweden is a great partner to Canada.
Canada just experienced one of the most remarkable diplomatic moments of the year, one that cuts directly to the heart of the Canada-U.S. relationship and reveals how the world is quietly shifting its alliances in 2025. Standing in a Canadian TV studio, Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister Ebba Busch delivered a message so clear, so blunt, and so politically symbolic that it immediately reverberated through Western capitals. You need to choose your friends wisely, she said, and Sweden is choosing Canada. At a time when the United States is pressuring Ottawa over the F-35 contract and warning that NORAD cooperation could be reconsidered, Sweden arrived on Canadian soil and publicly picked Carney's Canada over Trump's America. It wasn't a polite diplomatic gesture, it was a strategic declaration.
The exchange happened during Bush's exclusive interview on Canadian television. She was in the country with an unusually high-level delegation: Sweden's king and queen, top cabinet ministers, and senior executives from major Swedish firms, including Saab. Their visit centered on deepening economic and security cooperation, and more specifically, presenting Saab's Gripen fighter jet as a serious alternative to the U.S. F-35s Canada has ordered. Under the original plan, Canada committed to purchasing 88 F-35s from the United States, but ongoing delays and swelling costs have left a significant capability gap. Only the first 16 jets are unscheduled to arrive. That leaves more than 70 aircraft unfilled, which suddenly makes Sweden's timing very strategic. Bush made it clear that Sweden can produce those jets, deliver them, and even build substantial portions of the production line inside Canada. What made this interview remarkable wasn't just Sweden pitching a fighter jet. It was Sweden openly acknowledging the political pressure the United States is exerting on Canada and contrasting that behavior with their own. When asked about U.S. warnings that NORAD could be affected if Canada considers a non-American jet, Bush responded with a directness rarely heard in diplomacy. If you cave under pressure from a so-called friend, she said, that weakness will be exploited. The message was unmistakable. Sweden was telling Canada, we don't threaten our allies, we don't weaponize security partnerships, and we don't make you choose between sovereignty and cooperation.
To understand the weight of Bush's words, you have to look at the global context. The world in 2025 is increasingly unstable, with Putin's war continuing in Europe, China limiting its rare earth exports, and Donald Trump's second term redefining Washington's approach to alliances. The U.S. now ties trade, security, and diplomacy together in ways that create uncertainty for partners. Sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, threats to Canada's auto industry, and warnings over defense cooperation have all become part of a larger pressure campaign. That shift is pushing many countries, especially in Europe, to reconsider who they trust. Sweden's deputy PM didn't hide that reality. She said the United States has become much more unpredictable, and that Sweden is actively seeking partners who uphold shared values without using leverage or intimidation. In her view, Canada is one of the few countries that meets that standard, a stable, dependable middle power with a consistent commitment to democratic principles and multilateral cooperation. What's striking is that this isn't an isolated opinion. Reuters, Bloomberg, and Global News all report increasing European unease with Trump's foreign policy. Countries like Sweden, Finland, and even Germany have been quietly expanding defense ties with Canada, particularly after Ottawa helped accelerate Sweden's entry into NATO. There's a sense that Canada, under Mark Carney's leadership, offers a level of stability and reliability that Washington can no longer consistently guarantee. Carney's global strategy has amplified Canada's international voice. In the past few months, Canada has signed a security partnership with South Korea, advanced trade talks with ASEAN, and doubled down on its critical minerals strategy with Japan, Germany, and now Sweden. Canada is actively rebuilding the industrial alliances that protect its economic sovereignty, and Sweden's announcement fits perfectly into that narrative. The Gripen E isn't just another fighter jet on the market. It represents a completely different model of partnership, one where Canada gains industrial capacity, not just aircraft. Saab has already told CBC and the Globe and Mail that it is prepared to shift substantial production to Canadian soil. That means Canadian aerospace workers get the jobs, not American factories. It also means that maintenance, technology transfer, and long-term economic benefits stay inside Canada instead of flowing south of the border. For Washington, that is a direct challenge. The U.S. uses arms exports, especially the F-35 program, as a tool of geopolitical influence. When allies buy American jets, they also buy decades of maintenance contracts, supply chain dependency, and strategic alignment. If Canada takes a different path, it sends a message that the United States is no longer the only option for advanced military systems. That is why the U.S. ambassador's warning about NORAD hit such a nerve. It sounded less like cooperation and more like coercion. Sweden's counter-message could not have been more different. Bush essentially told Canada a real ally doesn't need to threaten you. A real ally earns your partnership.
It's no accident that Sweden's diplomatic tone is so warm toward Canada right now. Since taking office, Mark Carney has pushed a foreign policy defined by diversification, independence, and long-term strategic planning. His government is actively reducing Canada's reliance on U.S. supply chains, especially in defense, energy, and critical minerals. Carney is presenting Canada as a global partner that is principled but not naive, open to cooperation but unwilling to be pressured. Sweden clearly sees this. Bush praised Carney's global strategy in the interview, saying Canada is choosing its friends very strategically, and that Sweden wants to deepen that alignment. It's a diplomatic compliment, but also a recognition that Canada is emerging as a central player in the Western realignment.
Sweden didn't just bring a proposal to Canada, it brought a public declaration of trust, one that directly contrasts with the behavior Canada has been facing from its closest neighbor. In a world where alliances are shifting and great powers are acting unpredictably, Sweden chose to say out loud what many U.S. partners have been whispering. Canada is becoming the reliable anchor in a turbulent era. The real question now is how Ottawa responds. Canada can accept a partnership based on respect and mutual benefit, or it can continue navigating a relationship where cooperation is tied to threats. Sweden just placed its bet, and it chose Canada.
President Trump announcing a fresh tariff hike on Canada, and it comes after an international spat over Ontario Premier Doug Ford's use of a 1987 Ronald Reagan radio address on tariffs and trade.
Carney says he has a plan.
Building at home, diversifying our trade relationships abroad, and being ready to work with the United States government as and when the time comes.
When President Donald Trump slapped another tariff on Canada, few expected the most powerful response to come in the form of calm. As cameras followed Prime Minister Mark Carney boarding a plane to Asia, he wasn't shouting or retaliating. He simply said that Canada would stay ready to talk when the United States was ready too. In Washington, that quiet tone was almost disarming. Trump had just reignited a feud with Canada after a television ad in Ontario used a 1987 Ronald Reagan speech criticizing tariffs. The American president called it fake, ended trade talks, and added a new round of tariffs. But what was meant to humiliate Ottawa has instead revealed something deeper. Carney's restraint has started to expose the limits of Trump's economic power. The new 10% tariff on Canadian imports halted months of negotiations that were close to producing a steel and aluminum deal benefiting both sides. For many analysts, the move wasn't economic, it was personal. Trump had turned a provincial ad into a political provocation, using his trade authority to punish critics and prove he could still dominate America's allies. Yet, the more he swings that hammer, the weaker it becomes. After nearly a decade of tariff battles, the world has grown used to Trump's volatility. Bloomberg analysts now track each new tariff announcement as a routine event. The same markets that once trembled now simply adjust. Trump's unpredictability, once his greatest weapon, is starting to look like predictability in disguise.
While Trump was reacting to an ad, Carney was redefining the rules of engagement. He told Canadians to focus on what can be controlled, building at home. That message is not passive, it's strategic. Ottawa's 2025 budget commits hundreds of billions to clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and industrial infrastructure. This inward investment has replaced retaliation as Canada's main defense. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec are coordinating to fast-track industrial projects and stabilize supply chains. For foreign investors, that consistency matters. A report by Statistics Canada shows a 14% rise in foreign manufacturing commitments during the first 9 months of 2025, much of it in energy and metals, industries directly hit by U.S. tariffs. Carney's calm, far from weakness, has become a form of economic strength. He is proving that confidence can be louder than confrontation. The breakdown in talks has unexpectedly accelerated Canada's expansion abroad. As Trump closes doors, Ottawa is opening others. Carney's trip to Malaysia for the ASEAN summit marks the start of a larger plan to connect Canadian exports, minerals, technology, and clean energy with Asia's booming economies.
Instead of waiting for Washington, Canada is rewriting its playbook. The goal is to anchor its industries to multiple markets, not one. In practical terms, this means securing long-term partnerships in lithium, copper, and renewable components, the same sectors distorted by US-China rivalry. What began as a pause in North American talks is now a structural realignment of Canadian trade strategy. For decades, Canada's prosperity has risen and fallen with America's economic moods. Carney is trying to break that cycle.
Inside the United States, the ripple effects are becoming clear. Farmers and manufacturers, groups central to Trump's political base, are struggling under rising input costs. The National Association of Manufacturers warns that constant tariff shifts are eroding predictability for business operations. Reuters polling in September found support for Trump's trade policy slipping in key farming states, where cross-border exports once sustained local economies. Instead of protecting U.S. jobs, the tariff wars have made planning nearly impossible. The American Chamber of Commerce reported in its September 2025 survey that 62% of mid-sized manufacturers delayed or canceled investment decisions due to trade uncertainty. Each new tariff might win headlines, but it costs confidence, and that's the currency every economy depends on. Meanwhile, Canada's tone of stability has made it a magnet for investors seeking predictability. Trump's America First approach, intended to isolate rivals, is slowly isolating America itself.
Trump and Carney both flew to Asia in October, but for entirely different missions. Trump's meetings revolved around confrontation, China, tariffs, leverage. Carney's focus was cooperation, partnerships, trust, and access. In Kuala Lumpur, ASEAN leaders welcomed Canada's outreach. Japanese and Korean officials described Ottawa as a dependable alternative in uncertain times. Even Beijing, locked in trade battles with Washington, has begun portraying Canada as a stabilizer in global supply chains. Chinese media note that Canada's reliability could offset America's volatility. Whether that perception holds or not, it signals something important. The balance of economic credibility is shifting. A few years ago, the idea of Canada standing as a counterweight to U.S. economic power would have seemed unrealistic. Today, it looks entirely possible. Trump's tariffs were meant to bring manufacturing home and strengthen U.S. leverage. Instead, they are teaching allies how to operate without it. Canada, Japan, South Korea, and the EU are forming new agreements that bypass Washington altogether. The strategy designed to isolate China has gradually isolated the United States. And while Trump's tactics grow louder, Carney's approach grows steadier. His patience has exposed a paradox. The more Washington tries to command loyalty through pressure, the more its partners learn to move independently. The lesson is simple. Power that relies on threats loses value once the threats no longer scare anyone. Carney's restraint has become Canada's strongest weapon, because in this trade war, calm isn't surrender, it's control.
This story began with a commercial and ended as a global turning point. Trump's tariff politics, once a symbol of strength, now reveal the limits of intimidation. Markets no longer fear his tweets. Allies no longer wait for his approval. Carney's response, measured, strategic, quietly confident, has shown that leadership is not about volume but vision. The United States still has enormous influence, but influence without credibility is fragile. In trying to corner Canada, Donald Trump may have cornered America's reputation instead.